Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast. I'm your host, John Slick Baum. You've often heard us talk about how the United States Air Force is the oldest and smallest that it's ever been. This is across the board, from tankers to bombers. But today, we're going to talk about fighters. So what's the deal with Air Force fighters? About 80% of them were bought during the Reagan administration. That means the jets are older than most of the fighter pilots who are flying them today. And while they've been modernized with new sensors and equipment, their airframes are tired and worn. And I mean literally. There's only so many times you can pull high Gs, go supersonic, carry heavy ordnance, and live outside on a ramp before the core structure of a combat aircraft simply isn't viable anymore. The F-16 that I flew, the F-15, the A-10, they're all increasingly expensive to maintain and fly, and they can't fly to their full performance envelope, and they just don't have the capabilities or attributes necessary to fight against an adversary like China or Russia. And that's got to be the yardstick we use for relevance, not just what's a sentimental favorite or what was deemed viable over Iraq and Afghanistan when we controlled every part of the sky. So Heather Lucky Penny, one of our senior fellows here at the Mitchell Institute, recently completed a study on the Air Force plan for its fighter force structure, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So joining her, we've got General Deptula, the Dean of the Mitchell Institute.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing great, sir. We've got Mark Gunzinger.
Hello, Slick.
Hey, Mark. And Doug Berkey, our Executive Director.
Hey, man, how you doing?
I'm doing awesome. Well, Lucky, let's get this thing kicked off. And why is this report so important, and why is it so important right now?
Slick, let me cut to the chase. The Air Force's fighter force is in crisis. After 3 decades of canceled, curtailed, and delayed investment in modernization, the nation now finds itself in major need of these capabilities, with far too few advanced fighter aircraft to meet the demand. You know, this isn't just an Air Force problem. It affects every aspect of U.S. national security. No form of power projection in any domain is viable without the control of the sky. Ships at sea, forces on the ground, space control centers, cyber facilities, logistics hubs, that none of it will make it when hit with high-intensity attacks from the sky. And we haven't had to think like this for decades. But I got news for you. We're at that merge now, given where China and Russia are pushing. Without a capable fighter force to back up U.S. diplomacy and joint military operations, U.S. leadership will lose security options when they need them the most. And paying that price will be measured in seeing global norms and a rule of law that we've worked for decades to establish erode, because competitors want to tilt the table in their favor. People take U.S. air power, and specifically Air Force air power, for granted because it's all they've ever known. But guess what? Other countries have vastly different interests, values, and ways of doing business. They are playing to win. Just ask someone living in Hong Kong how life has changed for them over the last year.
No, Heather, I totally agree, and I get it. And what these aircraft create is not only an end to themselves, but the conditions vital for everything else in the military, the State Department, our national leadership, and even our economy. So, General Deptula, you've been watching these trends play out since the 1970s. And why are things so precarious today with Air Force modernization? And also, as a publisher of the report, can you speak to its importance?
Yeah, sure, Slick. Let me answer your second question first. To reinforce what Heather said up front, the Air Force fighter inventory is in crisis. And her report stakes out several key points that need to be addressed in order to resolve that crisis and get us back on a vector to a healthy fighter force. That's the purpose of the paper. And given the fact that it's brought attention to the topic and further discussion on how to best do that, it's accomplishing its purpose. Now, the most important macro-level issues being highlighted in the report that I'd like to highlight are 2. First, making sure that the Congress and the public understand what the Air Force needs in terms of fighter capability and capacity to meet the demands of the national security strategy. To cut to the chase, what that means is the Air Force needs to go back to an annual presentation of both a planning force that identifies the forces necessary to execute the national defense strategy, as well as the programming force, which is the budget-constrained forces allowed that we always present as part of the POM. The second major point I want to highlight, and the report highlights, is raising the understanding about the deficiency in funding of the Air Force that's masked by the current $39 billion of pass-through over which the Air Force has no control. Now, with that pass-through, it appears to the public and to the Congress. And by the way, I had dinner with a senator last night, and he made that point. He goes, hey, no one in Congress outside a handful of senators and representatives understand what they see is that the Air Force is at the top of all the services for funding, when in fact it's actually number 4 behind the Army, the Navy, and other DoD agencies. Now, the other 6 of the 8 recommendations in the report are more specific regarding fighter programs, and I'm going to let Heather go into those in more detail. But the point underlying the entire paper is that until the Air Force comes up with a force sizing methodology that it can use to publicly and clearly and easily explain the tie between the National Defense Strategy and its fighter force structure requirements, it's going to continue to face challenges in getting support for increased funding for our fighter force from both Congress and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for the capacity that the Air Force needs. So all of this kind of ties into the answer for your first question regarding how Air Force fighter modernization got into such a precarious predicament. The short answer is neglect by the senior DoD leadership for nearly 3 decades. To those who follow the travails of the armed services, this really shouldn't come as any surprise, as for each of the past 27 years in a row, the Air Force has received less funding than either the Army or the Navy. The modernization of the Air Force during this time frame was simply deferred due to other DoD priorities that were at the top of the attention box of the Secretaries of Defense. Anemic funding for new aircraft combined with higher than expected usage of those aircraft has worn our hardware and the associated personnel badly. To put a figure on it, today, 80% of the Air Force fighter inventory is operating beyond its planned service life. Now, here's another reason that the Air Force has continued to decay. Since 9/11, the Army budget share was increased due to land-centric operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, we got it. But the fact of the matter is the Army received over $1 trillion more than the Air Force. That's an average of over $53 billion a year more than the Air Force over that time. Now, we're no longer in either of those places, and demand for Air Force capabilities growing in every combatant command, and it's the Air Force that will provide the preponderance of forces necessary to fight and win in a pure conflict. So it's now time, actually well past time, to rebalance that allocation to modernize and recapitalize the Air Force.
Well, sir, thanks so much for that. And Gonzo, I know you've done a lot of research and analysis on strategy and resourcing. So what is your take on this?
Sure. So let me talk about future force planning in plain speak. It really is a matter of projecting future requirements for a particular part of the force, like the Air Force's fighter inventory, and then determining the required capabilities and capacity of that force. It's a classic supply-demand relationship. However, unlike in the field of economics, if operational demand for a military force far exceeds the supply, the results can be devastating, potentially existential, resulting in defeat in a conflict against, well, in this case, China and Russia. So thinking of current and future demand, we are now in an era of multipolar strategic competition. China has made it clear it intends to assert control over Taiwan, using force if necessary. And Russia is rattling its saber in Europe today, as we speak, by massing forces on the border of Ukraine. The threat of great power aggression in 2 theaters is very real, and that threat will continue to grow, not diminish. So the point is, despite that reality, DoD abandoned its long-standing requirement to size its forces for 2 major wars, in part because a recent Secretary of Defense didn't think the defense budget would bear the cost of a 2-war force. We think that 2-war force for DoD would be affordable, or at least more affordable, if DoD's planning is informed by the predominant forces that will be needed to defeat peer aggression in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, instead of allowing each service to determine its own requirements. And since the conflict with China would be sea, airspace, and cyberspace domain dominant, the Navy Marine Corps should size and shape primarily for that fight. And in Europe, a major conflict with Russia would be land, air, space, and cyberspace domain dominant. So the Army should size primarily for that fight, instead of also trying to fund very expensive long-range strike, ISR, and other capabilities for an Indo-Pacific conflict. But notice I mentioned air and space for both theaters. That means the Air Force and the Space Force should be sized for both, and you should have the resources to do that. Plus, only aerospace power can respond over global distances on day one of a conflict to blunt a Chinese or Russian invasion.
Well, Mark, how does this compare to what we have today?
So that's the supply side of the equation. The very short answer is the Air Force of 2021 is not a two-war force, and it isn't even a one-war force. In 2019, the Air Force reported to Congress that it needed to grow by about 23% to 386 total operational squadrons to meet the defense strategy requirement to size for one major war, plus defend the homeland and deter nuclear threats. That 386 squadrons was called the Air Force we need, included growing an additional 7 fighter squadrons. But since then, the Air Force has continued to shrink, not grow, primarily due to inadequate budgets. So I believe it is fair to say the Air Force has a high-risk, one-war force today, and for 2 major conflicts, it's very high risk. Now, I'll finish by quoting a sentence out of that Air Force report to Congress that I mentioned, and I quote, "Finally, the increases in capacity do not mean buying more of the same. We need to increase lethality against the first challenging targets in contested environments." So that quote means the Air Force needs more 5th and 6th gen combat aircraft and other capabilities that are suitable for peer conflict, not wars of the past. So buying down existing risk means increasing the capacity of the Air Force's high-end capabilities as fast as possible, not just adding to its numbers.
Yeah, Mark, I appreciate that analysis. And switching over to Heather, what were your major findings in the paper?
Well, so let me just say that what General Deptula and Gonzo said sets the stage perfectly for the context of this report. We need to understand that this report and my recommendations were not about being perfect. It's fundamentally about triaging where the Air Force is today and how to hedge risk for the next decade, the 2020s. So this means resetting the force in a pragmatic, viable fashion that considers real-world operational factors, political realities, and past acquisition lessons. So we sought to address what can be done now to hedge that risk in the 2020s and how to plant the seeds for the future. So here's the quick hits. Remove the pass-through. Air Force resourcing has been obscured and distorted because of that pass-through. So the nation needs more accurate accounting of defense budgets if it's going to make smart choices and trade-offs in the DoD top line. Second is the planning force, and General Deptula and Gonzo both spoke to this. The Air Force has to have an unclassified, publicly releasable planning force based on the National Defense Strategy. And again, Gonzo mentioned a 2-war simultaneous sizing. So we need to understand what the service needs in order to be able to execute those operations in an unconstrained budget environment so that we can understand the risk we're assuming with the programmed force. That's the force that we can afford.
Gotcha.
So we have to then think about how do we hedge risk today? First, keep F-16 in the inventory. We already own it. It's great for low-end types operations, homeland defense, and it's cheap. But part of this legacy plan is Congress has got to allow the Air Force to wholly divest the other legacy platforms like the A-10 and the F-15C. Second in this hedging risk strategy is we've got to keep the F-22 modernized until next-gen air dominance is fully operationally capable. I get it. F-22 is expensive, but it's also the most capable fighter in the world, and we need it until we actually get NGAD in the capabilities and capacities that matter. And then we have to ramp up the production of the only 5th-generation stealth fighter that is in production to rebalance the stealth to non-stealth fighter ratio. We have to move the stealth ratio beyond 20%, higher. And this is what's also going to allow us to retire the whole fleets of legacy aircraft that I mentioned earlier, right? The A-10, F-15C. And, part of this, and this is a little bit of the geeky side of the F-35, is we've got to transition F-35 program management out of the Joint Program Office to the services. It's time to close the JPO.
Sure.
So then we had to think about, how do we prepare for the future today? Part of that is beginning a new stealthy general purpose fighter. That design has to complement the NGAD, and it has to be the low part of a high-low mix. And then finally, we need to accelerate and remain steadfastly committed to next-gen air dominance, because that is the core of the future fighter force.
Sure. Now, in really great words there, Heather, but have to say it seems like you split from the Air Force in some of your findings, and that's causing quite some controversy in the defense circle. So what drove you to think about those differences?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, I don't think we're actually that far off from the Air Force's official position. Folks in the Air Force are super smart, and they understand the problem set pretty darn well. And we clearly want what is best for the Air Force and the mission area as a whole. So that's why we actually agree on a lot of the points. Things like needing to prioritize NGAD, continuing to extend out the healthiest portions of the existing legacy fleet, and fundamentally emphasizing that things have to change. Where we differ comes on exactly what that new lower end, new design fighter might look like. We think it should have stealth capabilities, so that can be that complement to NGAD. And we also differed with the Air Force on how we wanted to balance risk with F-35 and fundamentally how F-15EX fits into that equation.
Yeah, Heather, you got to flesh that out some more for me, because I know we've talked a lot about F-15EX.
Yeah, you bet. But first, let me talk about that alternate fighter and kind of why we took the position on F-35 that we did. So first off, on starting a new design complement to NGAD, it's that classic high-low mix approach like what we saw with F-15 and F-16, right? A new start aircraft program is critical to fill this role, not only because of affordability issues, but we need to have that kind of capacity. And we also need to have an aircraft that's going to be able to handle some of those lower-end operations, right? NGAD, Next Generation Air Dominance, is going to pursue some performance factors. Think range, payload capacity, information attributes, survivability technologies. It's going to really penetrate, and a lot of these things are probably going to drive the cost up. So we might not get as many as we want. So this is going to limit how much the Air Force can buy. Just look at history. We always had less F-15s, that high-end fighter, than we had of F-16s, because the F-16 was cheaper to buy and operate, even if it wasn't quite as capable as the F-15. So NGAD will need something that complements it with those larger numbers, and that means a new design. If you think about it, F-22 and F-35 are going to be several decades old by the 2030s, and their software architecture will be especially outdated. The demand for more power, space, cooling to run systems and sensors is going to be an issue, especially as fast as competitors are driving technology change these days. So I'm thinking of a jet that's far more modular. It embraces technologies like stealth and advanced electronic warfare, fully plugged into ABMS JADC2. And, for this modularity piece, I should explain this more. Think about separating the jet, the airplane itself, right, from the mission systems, the sensors, the weapon modules, and so forth. It's that information architecture, it's a sensor architecture that's been killing us for the last 20 years because it's so tightly integrated that it takes forever to develop and test. Instead, updates to systems and new sensors must be fielded when they're ready. We have to be able to do that tech insertion, when it is ready, when we need it. We don't have a decade to wait from requirements to the modernization drop. We just simply don't have that time anymore. So if a specific module is having developmental problems, we can't hold the rest of the jet back. We've got to fix those problems and move on, right? So we need to begin working on that technology today. I also believe that any new aircraft has got to be stealthy. And I get it. The Air Force is now refocusing on electronic warfare and developing EW that's very sophisticated, and that's great. But I also believe that we need to have resiliency within the battle space. And EW plus stealth is a preferred path, in my opinion, because it gives adversaries a more diverse problem set.
Yeah, no, it absolutely all makes sense. And what else did you find?
Well, so let's talk about F-35. I looked at those current fighter buys and said we needed to double down on F-35 production now in terms of volume. This one garnered a lot of controversy because F-35 is experiencing some challenges and the Air Force is slowing its production rate, its annual buy. Now, while I agree Block 4 is the ultimate variant that the Air Force really wants for the Pacific region given certain capabilities, and we all want engines to be healthier, and we all want sustainment bills to be lower, we just can't wait for the stars to align and then surge production. If you know anything about aircraft production lines, they're not like water faucets where you can just turn it on, super fast. And also, there isn't going to be the cash then, because to be honest, waiting until the 2030s is too late to hedge risk for the 2020s. Plus, we need to begin thinking about those alternate fighters in the 2030s anyways. So it's in this decade, we've got to love the one we're with. And buying the F-35 is the only credible fighter in production today that makes sense to replace and retire our legacy force. Now, there's no denying that ramping F-35 production today involves a modernization bill for the future to get them to Block 4. But I'd rather sort that out then than risk never getting the jet at all and having to extend the legacy fighters even longer. There are other costs incurred for not getting new jets on the ramp fast. I mean, if you think about it, we're having to pay bigger sustainment bills for all those older types. I know the F-35 we buy today isn't the Block 4 that we want in the future, but they are far more capable and credible than F-16s and F-15s and A-10s. So it kind of goes back to that Rumsfeld quote that you go to war with the force you have, not the force you wish you had. And when looking into the 2030s, I'd much rather have a Block 3 F-35 than an F-16.
Heather, I couldn't agree more, and I appreciate you really pointing this out to us. We're on a long road to get to where we need to be, but I got to turn the attention over to Doug and ask Doug for you to put on your Capitol Hill hat here. I want to ask you, how does Heather's argument stack up with the broader variables that you see?
No, I appreciate it. It's like we're in a period right now where the Air Force has taken risks for 3 decades. Gonzo and Joel Deptula touched upon this. And the 2020s are really set up as a decade to buy. The problem the Air Force has right now is they're coming off that a little bit. They're getting weak on F-35 buy rates. We're nowhere near where it was programmed at. The other elements in play are oftentimes sliding to the right too much. Just look at the money for NGAD. It's been cut year after year on the Hill. And so this is actually compounding risk to the point where we either get healthy now or the aircraft in play that are very old are going to effectively sunset. They're physically worn out. And so the mission will either just be absorbed in other things, but you don't have much to handle that, or just goes away because there's no aircraft left to fill the bill there. And so it's a zone where I think we have to be really, really pragmatic. That's why I agree with Heather where she's focusing on what are the options you actually have now that are viable. And it can't be just a PowerPoint slide saying, hey, it's all going to be great the next decade. We've been doing that for 3 decades in a row, and it's disastrous. So the real question right now is, given where the Air Force is budget-wise, can it afford 2 current fighter production lines and carry NGAD at the same time? And I agree with Heather. We need to look at a lower-end complement to NGAD. I mean, look at B-21 math. That's the fastest, healthiest program we have right now. The requirements on that were dropped, and the aircraft was selected in 2016. We're not going to have operationally viable quantities of that thing until the early 2030s. So if you want a complement for NGAD at the end of the 2030s, beginning of 2040s, you got to begin that process now. So that's really the debate on where do you put risk on F-15EX or F-35. And you can debate that how you want, but it really does have to be out there as a consideration point, because if you run 2 fighter lines at bare minimum sustainment rates, that's called a death spiral. Neither one is going to be healthy, and that's what we saw in the F-22, where they were down in the 20s per year. The overhead costs were not amortized enough. It drove unit costs extremely high. Congress got frustrated, administration got frustrated, they pulled the plug. We can't do that to 2 programs. Something has got to be healthy, so that's number one. Then we also have to talk about here, and this is very important for the Air Force to carry the water on, why are Air Force fighters fundamentally unique? I mean, we got Navy fighters, we've got Marine fighters, why do you need Air Force fighters? And fundamentally, it comes back to the point that no aircraft are more available for combatant commanders than Air Force fighters. They're not tied to a carrier for availability in theater. They are not tied to a MAGTF concept where they only belong to the Marine commander in theater. They're fundamentally available to fly missions anytime, anywhere for the COCOM commander for what is best for the joint fight. That's very unique. And nobody gets close to their mass. And so other services have air arms, but there's only one Air Force with that mass. It's crucial. So you got to keep this arm really healthy. And that's something that has to be pointed out to Congress because they don't really get that, and it's absolutely essential. Then we also need to talk about the narrative the Air Force has out there. We talk about the increasing risk that's going on with the threats that are out there and all of that. And that obviously for many decades has pointed to an all fifth gen force. And yet now you're introducing the EX out there. If there's something that is technologically changed with EW or something else, the Air Force needs to own that. But you cannot say we're going to not pursue the JSTARS recapitalization program because the aircraft are unsurvivable on one hand, and yet buy more fourth gen plus or however you want to call it fighters, which actually drive further into the flight. So if there's something out there, they got to get around owning that narrative. But right now it's very muddled. And then finally, NGAD has been getting killed on the Hill every single year. It is time for the Air Force to really push for that program. It is essential.
Yeah, Doug, I couldn't agree more. And I mentioned it before, you touched on it, so let's talk about F-15EX.
Yeah, but first, I also want to add something to what Doug said, and that's about the budget space that is going to exist within the 2030s, which is another reason why we see this decade as a procurement decade being so crucially important. Because the 2030s are going to see, basically a ton of really crucial cornerstone programs for the Air Force like GBSD, NC3, we've got B-21, you've got NGAD, you've got the new rescue helicopter. So we've got a lot of different programs that will be getting to production. And so there simply isn't going to be the budget space for additional fighters if we don't begin to do some of the remediation that we talked about regarding accelerating F-35 and retiring legacy fighters. So about F-15EX, we fundamentally saw the F-15EX as a budget trade-off to pursue other priorities in a limited budget environment. That said, we accept it's entering the inventory. So given that, F-15EX must be successful. The Air Force has to be careful that with this limited budget, it doesn't push both the EX and F-35 into the acquisition death spiral like what Doug talked about with the F-22. Second, the Air Force has to be careful to not repeat the small fleet mistakes with the F-15EX. So if we're going to buy the EX, it's got to make financial sense. And finally, and I think this part's really crucial, we need to use the EX to prove out future concepts. So use the development of the F-15EX to develop new systems architectures that are containerized, modular, flexible. Use it to break vendor lock on operational flight programs. And use the X to develop, test, and de-risk new technologies like sensors and weapons and EW for future aircraft. I wrote about these kinds of approaches in my last study on the industrial base, Building an Agile Force. The F-15EX could actually be an important bridge to that future alternate fighter we talked about and other aircraft if the Air Force pursues these courses of action.
Sure. Well, Lucky, I'm going to ask a tough question. I know that it was flagged on social media that you previously worked for Lockheed Martin and even spent some time on the F-35 program. So are you biased to the jet?
Look, everybody's got to work somewhere. And being in industry gave me some unique insight. I was up close and personal in the program, but that also means I saw its flaws and limitations too. If I was really a Lockheed Martin marketer, I wouldn't be recommending getting rid of the JPO, and I certainly wouldn't be advocating for a new START fighter. I see what the Air Force is trying to do with the EX program, and their motivations make a lot of sense. The Air Force wants to avoid a fighter monopoly. It wants to break vendor lock. It wants to move to open architectures to enable faster modernization. It wants to own data rights so it can better manage capability integration. And on the physical side, they want range, endurance, swap C, and outsized weapons payloads. But we had to make an offset choice within the budgetary context of today, the time frame, and the realism constraints that we gave ourselves. So if you think about it, the F-15EX is still in development. Its key technologies are not yet mature or proven, and how and when those turn out is yet to be seen. A stealthy new start has more potential for the future force, and it could integrate some of the capabilities the Air Force is developing for EX. So I do see value in using the F-15EX to burn down risk and maturing these technologies and approaches. But in the meantime, ramping F-35 is the best choice for this decade for both credible capacity, capability, and the immediate availability to retire our aged legacy platforms. An F-35 you don't buy today is an F-35 you don't have on the ramp in 2030.
Yeah, no, I definitely couldn't agree more. But Heather, you also talked about the threat a lot, and the China watchers are already sounding the alarms on what they're seeing here. So there appears to be a growing consensus surrounding China's ability and willingness to take action on their strategic goals within this decade. So just look at how they've engaged with Hong Kong and Taiwan as of late. So, and you spoke to that. Can you explain what you mean?
Yeah, let's talk about the notion of strategic surprise. So the concept refers to how much time the nation has to respond to certain events. I totally see China's ramping up aggressive actions big time. I mean, they know how stretched the U.S. is right now, and that actually incentivizes them for action sooner than later. China knows we might be stronger in 10 to 15 years, but we're pretty limited now. So consider this. It takes about 5 years to budget and build an aircraft. That's if there's already a hot line with current production. And it also takes about 5 years to train pilots. So that means if you need air power, you have a strategic surprise time horizon of 5 years. For example, even if we knew that we would have to go to war 3 years from now, we would already be 2 years too late just to begin to respond to the demand. That's why we're very focused on the report on building fifth-generation capacity now, because it's what we need to fight and win. We cannot continue to wait.
Well, I definitely couldn't agree more on that last one, Heather, but we're getting a little short on time here. So any last thoughts over to the team or parting words?
Yeah, Gonzo here. I talked about supply versus demand a little earlier, but my final comment is about capability versus capacity. Now, some of our brethren out there in other think tanks think the solution to the Air Force's problem is to trade its old iron so it can build the future force. The problem is you can't retire an old fighter and buy a new one with the resources you save. You're going to have to retire multiple fighters to afford to buy one. I think we'd all like to be able to retire our 30-year-old car and trade it in for a brand new one, even money, but we all know that's not going to happen. So the Air Force has traded capacity for capabilities for decades now, and it's now at a point where it needs both new capabilities and more capacity. And this is not an argument against retiring old iron. Far from it. The point is the Air Force is in a square corner. It has no other choice because it doesn't have the budget to build a new. And that's what we're arguing for. More top line for the Air Force so it could manage risk, bridge the future, and build that force that will prevail against China and Russia.
No, Gonzo, I really agree with all of that. And the other piece here, and I said it earlier, is the Air Force has got to get serious about recapitalizing today. They have deferred for far too long. It was thrust upon them for most of those instances, but now they've got to get healthy. The stack is only going to get worse the further we get closer to 2030. And this is going to be a crawl, walk, run approach. The notion that we're just going to flip a switch and build tons of F-35s when it gets to a point where we want it or some other program is just not practical. And we have to ensure that this is a long, steady build back to health.
Yeah, let me reiterate. The Air Force is the smallest and the oldest it's ever been in its history. Now, that's a result of 30 years of deferred investment. To remind you, the Army's received over $50 billion annually more than the Air Force. That money needs to come back to the Air Force and to a lesser degree to the Navy to rebuild the forces that will be in the most demand for pure fights, the most existential fights that we face, not elective fights. The Department of Defense then needs to get honest about service funding and remove the pass-through from the Air Force budget to where it belongs, and that's other DoD agency accounts. The current Air Force plan takes significant risks by getting smaller. Its plan's driven by the budget, not the strategy. And it's essentially cannibalizing itself to self-fund. This kind of gapping is a losing strategy, quite frankly. Now, all that said, perhaps the most important move the Air Force can make is to ensure that the public, the American people, and the Congress understand what the Air Force needs in terms of fighter capability and capacity to meet the demands of the national security strategy. Like I said earlier, and I'll reiterate it here, that means going back to an annual presentation of a planning force that identifies the forces necessary to execute the national defense strategy, as well as the programming force. That's the budget-constrained forces that it's given. The difference is risk. Finally, until the Air Force comes up with a force sizing methodology that it can use to clearly articulate the tie between the national defense strategy and its fighter force structure requirements, it's going to continue to face challenges in getting support for that force from both the Congress and the Office of Secretary of Defense.
All right. Well, I appreciate all of you guys being here. Thanks so much for the insight, and I've definitely learned a lot on this one.
All right. Well, thanks for your time, Slick. It was a good session.
Thanks, Slick. Till next time.
Yeah, take care.
As always, thanks, Slick.
Thank you, our listeners, for your continued support, and thank you for tuning in to today's show. Also, congratulations to our Aerospace Advantage Flight Patch giveaway winners, and if you entered the giveaway, don't forget to check out the giveaway video for next steps on how you'll receive your Flight Patch. Closing out this year and heading into a new one, we've got a lot of exciting new content coming your way, including a look at the MQ-9 reimagined and a few lighthearted flying stories for the holidays. Next year, we will also be heading out to air and space events near you, so don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn to find out where we'll be and what the Mitchell Institute has in our site picture. And please don't forget to leave us a rating, hit the like button, and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage podcast. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you think we should explore further. Visit us at mitchellaerospacepower.org to get the latest reports, events, and analysis that are charting the vectors for our air and space forces. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe and check 6.